conservation developments. And this is a trend that's moving throughout the communities in Washington County, here in southern Rhode Island. Randall Arendt and I are now working with 6 separate communities in revising their zoning, subdivision, and comprehensive plans to adopt conservation zoning as the requirement. This would be the pattern of the future, as opposed to conventional subdivisions with the big, wide, flat, straight streets and the big lots that go unused for the most part.
Bill Harmon, a former planning board member for Westford, Massachusetts, who currently serves on the Westford Land Trust, explains his town's zoning requirements from the backdrop of Jarvis Farm, a conservation subdivision in Westford.
The law, the way it stands right now, is that when a builder comes forward to propose a new construction of a subdivision, he's required to submit both an open space plan, similar to this, and a non-open space plan in which all of the land is used up by the house lots. And then, as these are compared in the review, compared by the builder and also by the town, the final decision as to which to get approved is the town's decision.
John Rowan, manager for Upper Euclid Township, Pennsylvania, discusses the use of flexible zoning tools, which his township employs to facilitate conservation design in proposed developments.
We have instituted a very creative approach to development through a new series of ordinances known as open space flexible design ordinances. We keep the base zoning classification in place, and we put an overlay over the township to provide developers an opportunity to develop in a much more creative and flexible way. Knowing that our key objective in design review and developments is open space and the preservation of open space and historical structures, this type of flexible zoning provides the developers an opportunity to be much more, as the title implies, much more flexible in their design, rather than that old Euclidean approach to zoning or the old cookie cutter approach where a developer would go in, strike the road, set the properties perpendicular to the road at 90-degree angles. This type of development provided a much more flexible advantage to the developer.
I like to focus on the subdivision ordinance as a type of regulation which is just as important as the zoning when addressing these issues. Many folks simply look at the zoning and think they've got the issues nailed and resolved, but really most subdivision ordinances have very poor procedures. They allow a developer to come in with a highly detailed, highly engineered plan, which is unfortunately called a preliminary plan, but it is highly engineered and very expensive. And once that is done, the developer has no wiggle room to change the plan. Conservation design should demand the developer comes in with a conceptual sketch. And the conceptual sketch is based upon a detailed site analysis for those site features, the primary conservation areas and the secondary conservation areas. That sketch plan should follow that 4-step design process: the open space, the house positions, the streets and trails, the lot lines. And that subdivision process should also include a site visit by municipal officials and staff, and maybe even abutters, while everything is fluid at the conceptual stage, where people can walk the property and get a feel for where the road will actually go and which trees will be saved or which parts of the farm field will be conserved. Without the benefit of a site walk, planning board members and planning commission members simply don't have a full appreciation for the property. You cannot look at a two-dimensional plan, a drawing, and understand what's happening three-dimensionally on the ground with topography, with trees. You have to walk the property, must walk the property.
When asked what he would like to say to developers throughout the country about conservation subdivisions, Peter Hausman offered the following.
I think developers have to look long-term. Many of them live in the communities. They have to take a longer-term perspective and think what they want these communities to look like for their children too. And if they do that, then the way we're going is just not the way. But having said that, it's, again, the developers are trying to play by the rules. That's the easiest way to get through the township. It's ultimately a municipal decision that they've got to change the land use regulations. Instead of one house per 1 acre, we got to break that mindset and start to think differently, from neo-traditional villages to other things. That if the resources are identified first, which is what they should be, then you've got to say, okay, where are you going to put the density second? And you know, it's our environmental and economic future that's at stake.
And people buy into the concept, which isn't too difficult, by preserving all this green space that everybody's talking about preserving, with no cost to the municipality themselves. It's a windfall in green space for that community.
Kevin Nineheist resides at Jackson Meadows, a 300-acre conservation subdivision located in the city of Marine-on-St. Croix, Minnesota. When asked what he would like to say to municipal officials throughout the country about conservation subdivisions, he replied,
"Oh, take the long view. Just the heritage of your community, I think, is decided both in the past and what you bring to it today, but the decisions you're making today as you look towards the future, that's the heritage that you're going to leave as a city official or some administrator. That's a significant piece of what you can do. You will be held in high regard. I think that has proven to be true here."
although the conservation subdivision movement gained momentum in the 1990s, an earlier predecessor, Radburn, at Fair Lawn, New Jersey, took form in 1929. Radburn was viewed as a model town for the motor age and was designed to protect people and property from the horseless carriage. The primary innovation of Radburn was the separation of pedestrian from motorized traffic. This was accomplished by replacing the traditional grid pattern of streets with a superblock. The superblock was a large block of land surrounded by main roads. The houses were grouped around small cul-de-sacs, each of which had an access road to the main roads. The remaining land inside the superblock was the park area, the core of the neighborhood. The main living areas of the houses faced the gardens and the park, while the service rooms faced the access road. At Radburn, a pedestrian could walk from home to the park or to schools, stores, or churches without ever crossing a street. Conservation subdivisions have a number of characteristics and attributes that bear a striking resemblance to Radburn, including common open space, views, trails and walkways which are accessible to all residents and the public as well. It is important to recognize that conservation subdivisions are not simply a form of cluster development, as Randall Arndt explains.
The type of developments that we're standing in right now and that I have advocated and helped design for years is called conservation design. And conservation design is a huge spin-off from what people used to call cluster development. But do not confuse the two, please. So conservation design is a huge improvement over both clustering and the conventional large lot approach. Large lot approaches produce no open space. They save no resource lands. Clustering, as it was practiced in the 70s and 80s largely, set their sights low with perhaps 20 to 30% open space, which could all be wetlands and floodplains. Whereas conservation design looks at the land and decides that typically 50 or more percent of the land should be set aside as open space as the first step in the design process. In a normal cluster development, the open space is smaller. It could all be floodplains, and it could all be fragmented into meaningless areas, a little fringe here and a distant piece of ground over there. Conservation subdivision design really tries to integrate the homes with the important parts of the property that are significant and noteworthy and worthy of preservation.
John Seidman suggests that the most important thing a community can do to encourage conservation subdivisions is to level the playing field between conservation subdivision developers and conventional subdivision developers.
The most important thing to encourage conservation development would be to incorporate language into your zoning ordinances that would level the playing field between a conventional subdivision and a conservation subdivision, so that the conservation developer will come in the door and have the same requirements that a conventional one would. At this point, most communities require an extra couple of hurdles with a public hearing or a conditional use, and that's expensive and time consuming and can cause a great deal of expense when it comes to redrawing plans because of public outcry, where a conventional subdivision developer may not be required to go through any public hearings or rezoning or conditional use meetings that invite the public out to nitpick everything that's done on a particular piece of property.
Randall Arndt explains why local officials would be well advised to make conservation subdivisions a permitted use and conventional subdivisions a conditional use.
The comprehensive plan should also have an implementation chapter that says, let's go back to the zoning ordinance and to the subdivision ordinance and update those two ordinances in a way that will facilitate this happening. So this is not just something that we cross our fingers and color our maps green. We color those maps green and then we write our codes and our ordinances so the developers really have to do this sort of thing. They sort of have to do it if we write our codes to make this type of development, conservation design, a permitted use, and the conventional development, the large lot sprawl, a conditional use. That's a very important distinction. A conditional use is a big negative for any developer. It means more time, more money, and absolute uncertainty as to whether he will ever get approval. Right now, communities are doing it exactly backwards. Many, many communities designate their conventional development as a permitted use by right, and they designate their flexible development with open space as a conditional use. They could hardly do things worse because there's a chilling effect. A developer looks at a conditional use and he says, no thanks, not going there. So communities that really want to preserve interconnected networks of open space will designate conventional developments as conditional uses and conservation design as permitted uses.
Voter-approved bond monies has been viewed as the traditional method of preserving open space resources. However, the use of public monies by communities to preserve land is a very limited tool.
That public bond money is an important tool, but it will only preserve maybe 5 or 6% of your community on the average, even if you vote millions and millions of dollars for acquisition. Now, I am not saying we should not have bond issues to acquire land, because then you can preserve the entire piece of ground that you're focusing on. But make no mistake, it is a very limited tool. It's like a laser tool. You can do a little bit here and do a little bit there. It's not a broad brush tool. The broad brush tool for conserving land is conservation subdivision design, which will apply to every piece of ground that is not preserved by land trusts or bond issue acquisitions.
Land trusts can play several significant roles in relation to conservation subdivisions. Jane Prohaska, Executive Director of the Minnesota Land Trust, explains what a land trust is.
Land trust is sort of a generic term for any nonprofit conservation organization that works with land preservation. They can be national organizations, statewide organizations, local organizations, and typically land trusts are smaller local organizations. There's somewhere over 1,200 land trusts now throughout the country, most of them smaller, based on a local community, a county, maybe a watershed, but there are a number that are statewide, like the Minnesota Land Trust. As I said, it really is a generic term that refers to any conservation organization that works with direct land preservation, either by acquiring the land outright and owning and managing it as a nature preserve, or working with a very different kind of tool, the conservation easement, which is what the Minnesota Land Trust does, is work primarily with conservation easements.
Land trusts have several roles to play. One is to perhaps introduce the idea to community officials, and you can introduce it to them in a video format like this, CD-ROM format, books. I do slideshows around the country, but get the information to your local planning boards and planning commission members if you're a land trust member. As a land trust member, you might also want to become involved with the planning board or planning commission in the design process. In York, Maine, for instance, the York Land Trust works with development applicants to kind of certify that they're designing around the best features of the property. It's not just happenstance. They design the conservation areas very deliberately according to the inventory and analysis maps.
York, a coastal town in Maine, has as its stated goal the preservation of 70% of the land within its boundary as open space. This will be accomplished, in part, through conservation subdivisions. Brian Chernak, a former town planner for York, discusses the working relationship between the York Land Trust and the town government.
About the time York started getting into a really heavy development boom in the 80s, the Land Trust started working with both the town on a cooperative basis and with the planning board in particular to try and encourage developers of subdivisions to look at other ways of doing things that preserved more of the open space and was better for both the developers and the town.
Jack Hines, Township Manager for West Bradford, Pennsylvania, discusses the arrangement the township has with the Brandywine Conservancy, a land trust which the township hires to work with developers on conservation design.
The Brandywine Conservancy and their staff works as a consultant for the township. When a developer comes in with a plan and a sketch plan, says and tells us that they want to develop a particular site, we ask them to meet with the staff of the Brandywine Conservancy and identify crucial things such as mature woodland, steep slopes, wetlands, floodplains, view sheds, and then develop a plan to preserve as many of those as possible. So they work directly with the developer. The municipality pays them for doing that, and then we rebuild the developer for those costs. So we're trying to manage the development in a way that will preserve as much of the natural conditions as we can, and make sure that the township's a nice place to live.
A land trust might also decide they want to receive some of the land that is conserved in this manner and add it to their collection of preserved acreages. However, most land trusts need an endowment if they're going to accept a gift of land. The gift of land is the gift that keeps on taking. It takes money from the land trust every year to pay taxes, to pay insurance premiums, and to maintain the land. Mow the meadows or trim the woods, especially around the roads, roadside edges. So if a land trust needs a certain amount of money each year to manage the land that's been given to them, our ordinance, our model ordinance, creates what is called an endowment lot over and above the normal number. If the normal number is 35, the developer builds 35 in a conservation subdivision and he gets a bonus lot, 1 or 2 bonus lots, with the net proceeds from the bonus lot going to the land trust as an endowment. So it's money we can actually manufacture. very legally through the ordinance language process. And those are three ways that land trusts can be involved. Advocating in the beginning, helping to lay out the open space during the design process, and also in receiving land if the developer and the land trust want to have a transaction.
Conservation subdivisions provide a variety of economic, environmental, and socio-recreational benefits, which are usually not associated with the sprawl pattern of development.
When developers visit these developments and speak with the people that have developed them previously, speak with the residents that live there now, they begin to understand that these places are really terrific. You can command premium prices for the lots because you're giving the consumer something more than a house lot and a street. Think about it. You go out to a large lot sprawling subdivision, what do you buy? Maybe you buy a 1 or 2 acre lot and you buy the access rights on the road in front of it. That's all. There is no preserved farmland or woodland, nothing special about the property. So there's a lot premium which can be built in. Also, there are lower development costs with conservation design because instead of pushing the roads out to all 4 corners of the property, the roads and the homes can be grouped into 1 or 2 or 3 sections of the property, leaving the other half or more of the property completely undeveloped. Not only do you not have to push roads through the other parts of this property, but you don't have to pull the trees down, dispose of their stumps, you don't have to do the grading operations. Basically, we leave Mother Nature alone on 50 to 60% of the property. So there are big savings to developers. Also, it has been demonstrated that homes in conservation subdivisions sell faster when they are designed attractively around beautiful open spaces. People respond to that. Quite a number of the subdivisions that are featured in my books, notably Rural by Design and Growing Greener, feature subdivisions where farmland, active farmland, has been preserved for crops.
Such is the case of the Ponds at Woodward in Kennett Township, Pennsylvania, where 47 acres of the 120-acre development are dedicated to apple production, and the city of North Oaks, Minnesota, initially a 6,500-acre conservation subdivision built around Pleasant Lake. Over 100 acres